Shen Qingqiu hopped up from the bare wooden couch and unconsciously felt up his form. At least all his clothes were still there, but even though his clothes were intact, he didn't really want to wear them anymore. Though they were on his body, he had an ominous feeling that they could be ripped off at any moment. Before he'd gone too far through the streets, Shen Qingqiu discovered that more than a few people had poured into Huayue City upon receiving notice of the warrant for his capture. Though many of the cultivators put on an act and didn't wear their sect colors while disguised as common people, when they sat down at roadside stands, their postures were entirely different from an ordinary person's. Shen Qingqiu felt it was too dangerous to go as he was, so he found a corner, smeared his face with dirt, and haphazardly stuck on some whiskers. After making all these preparations, he carefully returned to the street. When he glanced up at the sky, he saw that the clouds were thin, like they were slowly retreating. If no unexpected mishap were to occur, noon today would be the best time to escape. When he looked down again, a slender, snow-white silhouette flashed through the crowd in front of him, fast and light, their profile outstandingly handsome. Liu Qingge! His hired thug was here! Shen Qingqiu's eyes brightened, but just as he was about to chase after Liu Qingge, a delicate shout erupted from a nearby tavern. "What are you saying with your filthy mouth?" This voice was clear, delicate, and extremely familiar. Shen Qingqiu unconsciously paused mid-step, the scene drawing his gaze. Right afterward, a sequence of crashes shook the air, and all the passerby cast glances as well. At this time, another young woman humphed and said spitefully, "What? You have the guts for crime, but when the others talk? No wonder Chanqiu Mountain produced a degenerate like Shen Qingqiu. Everyone in the sect must be eager to bury their shame, especially Qingjing Peak. Huh! Unfortunately for you, everyone knows what kind of thing he is. You think you can hide it?" Wow, what a venomous tone. The young woman who'd spoken first jumped in to refute her right away. "Shizun absolutely isn't the kind of person who'd do something like this. Don't you dare slander him." Who else would speak so well of him now, if it's not Ning Yingying? Ming Fan's voice carried into the street as well. "We were only polite to you out of respect for the old palace master. You ought to be more polite as well." Though Shen Qingqiu had wanted to go and look for Liu Qingge, having urgent matters to tend to, this strange atmosphere made him hesitate for a second. In the end, afraid that Qingjing Peak disciples would be at a disadvantage, he stayed for a moment and ducked to the side of the building to hide and watch. There were two distinct camps in this tavern. One side was led by Ming Fan and Ning Yingying, while the crowd of Qingjing Peak disciples stood behind them, their every face filled with displeasure. The Little Palace Mistress stood in front of the other side, her hands on her hips as she faced her opponents with a cold scowl. The Huanhua Palace disciples behind her had already flashed their blades, their glares even more full of fury. Two young women, one lovely and delicate, the other with gorgeous features, gracefully faced off. Even if the air was filled with crackling, sizzling sparks, the scene was still incomparably easy on the eyes. Luo Binghe was setting fires in his backyard again. No, even Qingjing Peak disciples were involved, and they had challenged Huanhua Palace. This was the real, quote, enemies meeting on a narrow road, unquote. Shen Qingqiu could guarantee that if he left the scene and walked away right this instant, Qingjing Peak would definitely suffer more casualties, and greatly. Remember, this is Little Palace Mistress who was domineering to the point that other than Luo Binghe, there was no one in the world she wouldn't dare hit. Injury and crippling strikes were common dishes on her menu of retaliation. The Little Palace Mistress himphed. "Not that kind of person? Then tell me, why would he flee in fear of punishment? And he did that sort of thing." As she spoke, She clenched her teeth in hatred, the rims of her eyes going red.
Zhōng was never convicted. What do you mean flee in fear of punishment?
Ning Yingying shot back.
And there is still no final consensus on who committed these deeds. Our Changqiu Mountain never blamed your Huanghua Palace for being gullible and overly suspicious, or for insisting on imprisoning our Qingjing Peak Lord in your water prison without regard for the truth. If not for you, things wouldn't have blown up into the situation today.
Well, the reason for this beep fight wasn't the male lead, but Shen Qingqiu. Shen Qingqiu wiped his brow. By what merit does this humble Shen deserve this? At the same time, the dark cloud over his heart that he'd been unable to wipe away grew even darker. This argument just made it more evident that after he left, something had happened at Huanghua Palace, and these new grudges and old debts had all fallen on his head. The little palace mistress flew into a rage, though to tell the truth, Shen Qingqiu felt that she was always in a state of rage.
So you're saying that our Huanghua Palace only have ourselves to blame?
She snapped.
Changqiu Mountain is so impressive, so high up and domineering, so arrogant and unbridled that not only do you refuse to apologize, you have the gall to be so brazen towards the victims. With this kind of behavior, you still have the face to call yourselves the #1 major sect? Preposterous!
Ning Yingying curled her lip.
Changqiu Mountain has already been acknowledged by the masses as the #1 sect. Whether you accept that as fact doesn't matter. Moreover, who came at us first and acted brazen? Our Qingjing Peak was eating a perfectly peaceful meal in this tavern. What's your justification for coming up and cursing us out? First saying that you wanted our whole Qingjing Peak to kneel to you, kowtow, and apologize for our offenses, then saying that our entire Changqiu Mountain should be buried together? Exactly. Who is being preposterous? Huaya City is not your Huanghua Palace's backyard, or are you saying that the entire world is your house?
Ning Yingying's voice was delicate and crisp, and Shen Qingqiu was flabbergasted to hear it. How had the innocent, naive, and silly Ning Yingying become so good at catfights? And why was the little palace mistress acting like a beast not properly leashed in her cage, biting at everyone she laid eyes on?
Our Qingjing Peak has always cleaved to etiquette, Ning Yingying continued. Shizun was a proper teacher and said not to bicker with foul-mouthed little children. This is the only reason we've tolerated you thus far. Are you finished? If you are, then leave. Don't get in the way of our meal. I can't eat while looking at your face.
After she spoke, she picked up a cup of tea from the table and splashed it at the other girl's feet. The little palace mistress didn't dodge fast enough, and a few drops of tea splashed the hem of her dress.
You?
She screeched.
You shrew!
Mingfan couldn't take it anymore. Throwing aside his chopsticks, he sneered. Don't think we're afraid of you just because you're the old palace master's daughter. After all, you're just a little girl relying on her daddy. Neither your seniority nor your cultivation are worth anything. Though, when it comes to your ability to annoy, you are first-rate. Shrew, the way I see it, you're a bigger shrew than anyone else here. You've lost every last shred of Huanghua Palace's face. Shen Qingqiu was shocked. Qingjing Peak's disciples had always been so meek in front of him. They wouldn't even dare fart. If he told them to feed the chickens, they dared not to walk the dogs too. If he told them to make rice, they dared not to make congee. Yet it turned out they were actually quite the smack-talkers when let loose. The little palace mistress's face went white with anger. She'd heard Qin Wanyue say that this soft, bewitching little girl had been sect siblings with Luo Binghe for many years, as well as childhood friends and innocent playmates. All at once, envy and hatred flowed forth from her, and she suddenly raised her hand. A black shadow shooting out from her sleeve like a poisonous snake.
Fuck! She has a new whip!
When the other customers in the tavern saw that it was finally coming to blows, they left at top speed. Although, as they passed Shen Qingqiu, their expressions were unperturbed, like this was nothing strange. It seemed that the residents of Huayue City had long since grown accustomed to this sort of scene. The waiter even adeptly stuck a bill on the post before he walked out. The Little Palace Mistress was the old palace master's beloved daughter. Her martial skills were the product of his hands-on teaching, and her weapons were far from ordinary in quality. The whip strikes were swift and fierce. Meanwhile, Ning Yingying was a beloved youngest martial sister who was pampered by the entirety of Qingjing Peak. She very rarely encountered danger and had virtually no real battle experience. Her sword waved back and forth, and though she warded off the attacks, a keen eye could see she was having trouble. For his part, Mingfan wanted to aid her, but she couldn't get past the circle of the iron whip's dance and could only fret helplessly. Shen Jingqiu assessed the situation, then casually plucked a green leaf from the flower pot by his foot, which he sent flying. The fragile green leaf was filled with spiritual energy. When it collided with the iron whip, there was a piercing crash of something hard on metal. The Little Palace Mistress was unable to see what had gone wrong, but she felt the space between her finger and thumb go numb before her whip slipped from her hand and flew away. Ning Yingying also started. She'd been about to meet another attack with her sword, but once she saw that the Little Palace Mistress had no weapon with which to block, she hurriedly pulled back, afraid of really stabbing her. But the Little Palace Mistress had no similar mercy, and her reaction was supremely fast. The second her weapon left her hand, she reversed the momentum of her arm to turn it into a slap. Smack! Ning Yingying held her face, her head turned to the side. Fuck! The 5 fingerprints standing out on Ning Yingying's face and the cheek, already swollen on one side, went to show that the attack had been utterly ruthless. Shen Qingqiu's heart ached in terrible distress. You dare hit a disciple who even I never touched? However, at the sight of Ning Yingying's pretty face made lopsided, one side swollen, one side smooth, and all over tremendously unsightly, the Little Palace Mistress was enormously satisfied and felt she had vented her resentment. She rubbed her wrist, raised her chin, and laughed.
If your Shizun won't teach you, then let this palace mistress do it. Lesson 1. One must consider propriety when speaking. Who the fuck are you, trying to teach my disciples in my place?
Mingfan drew his sword.
You bitch, you've gone too far. Let's go all out.
The Qingjing Peak disciples couldn't take it any longer. Their youngest martial sister had been hit. How could they just let it go? They yelled and drew their swords, their blades gleaming with dazzling light. Shen Qingqiu was trying to figure out how to teach the Little Palace Mistress a lesson without inciting greater bloodshed or exposing his location as quickly as possible, when he suddenly noticed that within the crowd of Huanghua Palace disciples, one person was behaving most strangely and suspiciously. Shen Qingqiu observed that person for a few seconds, after which his heart thumped. Not good. It would no longer be so easy to slip away. At first glance, this disciple looked rather ordinary. They were mixed in with the crowd of Huanghua Palace disciples, hunched over and huddling close, gaze flickering around. Shen Qingqiu only noticed him because his face was one color, his neck another, and his hands yet 2 more different hues. Furthermore, within this agitated mob where everyone's blood was running hot, he didn't draw his sword or cry out for a fight, nor did he glare at the offending party with furious eyes. Instead, he brushed back and forth through the Huanghua Palace disciples with his head down, looking just like a pickpocket taking advantage of the ruckus. As far as Shen Qingqiu knew, only one type of person acted like this. While Mingfan was mid-clash, sword ringing and clanging, he looked back and cried, "Little martial sister, how are you?" Ning Yingying had halted for a while, like the slap had stunned her silly. Now she finally came back to her senses. Her face was half red, half white, expression furious and eyes teary, but she brandished her sword to fight back. She'd suffered this humiliation because she'd been momentarily soft-hearted. This time she would show no mercy whatsoever. The shop's interior descended into a massive brawl. To the side, Shen Qingqiu saw an old cat lazily curl its tail, licking its fur in the sunlight. He scooped it up with one single hand and tossed it into the tavern. Surprised, the old cat screeched and darted back and forth between the two fighting camps. Shen Qingqiu lowered his head and followed it, slipping into the circle of battle. Once the strange person had mysteriously pushed into the fray, both sides paused. Afraid to harm an innocent, Ning Yingying hesitated slightly, but the little palace mistress didn't have such reservations. Picking her whip back up, she lashed out as before. Shen Qingqiu chased the old cat back and forth through the hall, calling the name he'd given it on the spot. In the midst of this chaos, Ning Yingying's hands were obviously tied, especially as she was afraid to make a careless move. Yet she kept feeling as if someone was lifting her elbow, then like someone was pushing her shoulder. It was as if even when she didn't move her sword, it still danced, throwing off silvery light. Suddenly, 2 smacks rang out, and the little palace mistress held her face, dumbstruck and petrified like a wooden chicken, frozen on the spot. Those 2 slaps had been much louder and sharper than the one she had delivered to Ning Yingying's face. Everyone in both camps had seen Ning Yingying's arms fly, slapping first with one hand then the other, giving the little palace mistress 2 smacks in the face. In tacit agreement, they all stopped where they were.